guys, welcome back to Nadir Audio. In today's video we're going to take a look at the Sony WH-1000XM4 wireless noise cancelling headphones. So I picked up these Sonys about 6 months ago and I bought them as a replacement for these MPOW headphones, which I had reviewed in a previous video. You can take a look. These are very inexpensive $40 headphones and they actually sound pretty good for the price. And they work fine as a wireless headset as well. But the problem I ran into with these, they work fine for work, but if I was just wearing them and I wanted to take a break or switch and listen to some music or something, while they sound fine, I've kind of gotten used to some slightly higher end headphones at this point. And so I would find that I would always just turn these off and then plug in one of my other sets of headphones. So I thought, well, it would be nice to have a pair that I could use for serious music listening as well as using as a headset. So the Sonys come in this really nice carrying case here that zips open. There's just a couple of accessories here. There is an airplane adapter if you still need one of those, along with a cable to use it. And then there's this really tiny little USB charging cable. But other than that, these fit in the case really well and we can just unfold them. And you can see that these headphones are actually very similar. I wouldn't be surprised if the MPOW were modeled after the Sonys. But I will say that in terms of sound quality, it really is night and day. These things sound great, and we're going to talk about that. For the most part, this video is going to be focused just on the sound quality, so we'll get to that in the next segment. But there are a couple places actually where the MPOWs are better in terms of being a headset. One is they actually have physical buttons on the side. These are just kind of these cheap little plastic buttons, but when you're wearing them, it's very easy to reach up and feel where the button is, whereas the Sony has these sort of virtual buttons on the side for going backwards and forwards, for volume, for pausing and playing, and for the phone functionality that's on here. But I find that when you're wearing them, you're kind of hunting around a little bit. It can be a little bit hard to find them, so I find that I usually just use the controls on the device instead of using those. But the real difference with the headset is on the built-in microphone. Surprisingly, the microphone on these Sonys is really not that great. I tried to use this for about a week at work and got lots of complaints. People couldn't really hear me. The volume was always low. The voice was scratchy. So they didn't work nearly as well as these, where I was always loud and clear. So I wouldn't recommend, these didn't really work out as a headset replacement, but I like them so much as just a set of headphones for listening to music that I've been using them for that a lot over the last 6 months. So that's mainly what we're going to focus on in this video. So I've been listening to the Sonys a lot for the last few months, but I haven't done any comparisons with other headphones until recently. So for the last few days, I've been doing some A/B comparisons, and for this video I decided to do the comparison with the HiFiMan Sundaras here. So if you haven't seen my full review of these, I'll include a link to that video in the description below. But I think that these headphones are fairly comparable. Now they're very comparable in price. They both hover around the $350 mark. But I also think they're comparable in performance despite being very different. So the Sundaras obviously are planar magnetic headphones, open back, and the Sonys are noise cancelling Bluetooth headphones, closed back obviously. So for these comparisons, actually I've just been using the Sonys in the full noise cancelling mode because I think they sound best that way, sound better than in the ambient mode. So just in kind of broad strokes of differences between these two. So both of these headphones image well, but the Sundaras definitely have a larger soundstage, and I think they're a little bit more resolving in the high end, and they definitely have a more spacious sound. They capture a lot of that ambient room sound that I'm fond of in really good recordings, whereas these tend to have a much blacker background, less on the room and ambient sound, and I think that's partially just because they're noise cancelling headphones. But again, I think they both image well, but they're different in that category. I think they both are great in the mid-range. They both get a nice tone, and the Sonys definitely have a fuller bass sound. They both have a good, well-defined bass response, but I think that the Sonys are just generally fuller in that frequency range. So those are some of the kind of broad differences, but I think if we talk a little bit more about some of the specific recordings I've listened to, we can get into the details a little bit more. So I listened to a few rock albums with these two headphones. Now, I should mention I was listening to the Sundaras through my Emotiva Bass XA100 amplifier and a Shitmodi 3 DAC. So if you've seen my previous video on the Sundaras, that was one of the combinations that worked pretty well. So one of the albums I listened to, I was revisiting some of the 90s sort of alternative rock albums that I listened to a lot back then. So one of them was PJ Harvey's Rid of Me. Now, this is an interesting recording. It has a lot of dynamics where it shifts from very quiet passages to very loud, heavy passages. And I do feel like the Sundaras were a little bit better at capturing that. And again, there was a little bit more of that room sound, a bigger sound stage, and a little bit more information at the high end. So, the cymbals on the drums were just a little bit more clear, a little bit more sparkle at the top end than the Sonys. But then the Sonys, of course, were giving us the fuller bass, which on that recording is very nice. And one other thing that the Sonys did well is that because they have sort of a more intimate soundstage, you feel a little bit more like PJ Harvey's voice is closer to you, which might be something that you might like better. So these were two different experiences, but they both sound very good with that album. Now, another album I listened to was Gloss Drop by Battles. Now, this is a more modern recording, and it does have quite a bit of harshness, so I sometimes struggle with this album on my full setup with my A10 tube amp and the LS50s. And I feel like some of that harshness was being picked up with the Sundaras to the point that it was giving me a little bit of listener fatigue, whereas the Sonys, I feel like I was able to listen to and enjoy that album a lot better. Now I'm getting a little less detail, but I'm getting the full bass, and it's just taking the edge off things a little bit in a way that made it much more listenable. So that's one thing to bear in mind with the Sonys. So I also listened to a few classical recordings. So one of the ones I started with was Bach's French Suites, performed by Murray Pariah. Now this is a really excellent sounding recording, and it sounded really good actually on both of these. So we got a little bit more of that room sound, which is a little less important when you're just recording a single piano by itself with the Sundaras. A little bit more on the top end, a little bit more of the attack at the top end, but then I feel like they really filled out on the bottom end with the Sonys, and it was actually very pleasing to listen to on both of them. I feel like they're both highly resolving headphones, and I feel like they're both refined enough that you can really enjoy a recording like that. Now, with full symphony recordings, for example, I listened to Mahler's Symphony No. 5, performed by the London Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Jaap van Sweden. That one I definitely preferred the Sundaras because you get that bigger sound stage. It definitely feels like you're listening to a full symphony orchestra. You are getting a lot of little details from some of the instruments that are in the higher end. Whereas I felt like with the Sonys, on some of the heavier passages on that piece, it sounded almost a little bit muddy. And again, they didn't quite deal with the dynamics going from quiet to loud passages as well as the Sundara. So that was one of the less successful recordings with the Sonys, but it still was perfectly listenable. It's not something that I would stop listening to. It's still enjoyable. Now, I also listened to a few jazz albums. One of the ones I enjoyed was Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers' Free For All. Now, on this one, again, I liked, especially on the Art Blakey drums, on the cymbals, I liked a lot of that high-end sizzle that you could get with the Sundaras, which wasn't coming through as much with the Sonys. I feel like they both did great with the horns. They both had a very nice tone. Now, I do feel like that album, especially on the first track, Free For All, it can get very frenetic with the horns and all the drum stuff going on, and I feel like it is the kind of recording that if you're in a certain mood might lead to a little bit of listener fatigue, and I feel like the Sonys would be better in that regard again than the Sundaras, but personally my pick, I prefer the Sundaras for that particular album. Now, another album I listened to was Bill Frisell and Thomas Morgan, Epistrophe. So this is a really nice live recording, and I feel like, again, the Sundaras excel at that live spaciousness and picking up all the little details in the audience, chairs shifting and tinkling glasses, things like that. The Sundaras are really great at that. But these do perfectly well as well. I mean, they are more resolving. They pick up more of that stuff than a lot of my more inexpensive headphones. So they're no slouch in that regard, but I think the Sundaras are a little nicer there. But then again, we get that fuller bass, but I think on this recording it made a little bit less of a difference because while it was less full on the Sundaras were picking up a little bit more of the attack of Thomas's fingers on the bass strings, so which I kind of enjoyed. So on this recording, a slight nod to the Sundaras, but I feel like they were pretty comparable and I enjoyed listening to them both. Now, one recording I listened to where I definitely preferred the Sony's was Al Di Meola's Opus, which is a fairly recent recording of his. They're beautiful compositions. I really like the music, and the instruments themselves are not recorded too badly, but there's just way too much compression on this recording. And I feel like also the soundstage, everything is sort of, it's all kind of in the middle and a little bit dense, which I wasn't crazy about. And I've struggled listening to this album on my tube amp with the LS50s. I feel like the Sundara was more forgiving than that setup. I could actually listen to it and somewhat enjoy it, but some of those glaring issues with the recordings were still popping out to the point where I don't know that I would always be able to make it through the whole album with the Sundaras, whereas I was really able to enjoy it quite a bit with the Sonys. So there is something to be said for something that is resolving but is more forgiving for less than perfect recordings, because for most of us there are a lot of recordings in our collections that are less than perfect, and sometimes you just want to listen to something where you really like the music and you don't want to get listener fatigue. So I think in that sense they did really well. All said, I could be perfectly happy with either one of these headphones. I like them both a lot. If I had to pick one of these two to be my forever headphones, I would pick the Sundaras for the reasons that we talked about in this video, but I think the Sonys are great, and these are my go-to headphones now for when I'm listening to my iPad, not in my music room, anywhere on the go, anywhere where I need noise cancellation. They're great. Again, they didn't quite work out as a headset, but that's okay. I think they're, as a dedicated set of noise canceling headphones, they're really great, and I'm really happy to have them. So that's it for this one, guys, but I will talk to you all in the next video. Thanks.